everybody, and welcome back to OMB Reviews. I am the critic who is a cynic. Hope you're doing well, and today we're doing a box office breakdown for this past weekend, which saw Mean Girls once again take the #1 spot in a very, very slow box office weekend where the only new release barely even was in the top 5. I mean, we're talking about the new film I.S.S. getting into the top 7, so being beat out even by the likes of films like Aquaman and the Lost Kingdom, Migration, and others. And this film from Bleecker Street, so a smaller studio in comparisons to some of these others, but still a wide release at over 2,000 screens. Not a very good ratio. However, I will have to say that none of the other films are really doing all that great either, though the big issue I have, of course, is the fact that Amazon, MGM have not yet released in any way a budget for the Beekeeper. There's speculation as far as what it actually cost, but it makes my job of predicting things a little bit more complicated. So we'll talk about that, and of course talk about the latest from Tony over at Deadline as well. Before going any further though, please make sure you smash that like button, a lot of that fire button, honestly, and smash the rumble button as well. Also, make sure that you are subscribed to the channel with that bell notification on. That way you know every time a video or live stream goes live on the channel. And I will actually first start off also by saying I am now officially a writer for geeksandgamers.com. So if you want to follow the box office, just random articles here and there about certain franchises or just certain elements of box office analysis, go check me out over at geeksandgamers.com. I've got 2 articles up right now, actually. How to break the box office down going into budget marketing, the whole debate about break-even points and where that comes from, all can be found in my first article. And then I also have a recent article from just the other day about how I predict the box office after 2 weeks, and how actually a Star Wars story was the motivation and the inspiration for figuring out how these things actually work. So go check me out over there, and also try to get a weekly box office breakdown over on that site as well. So that way it is in a written form and probably a little bit more digestible form versus, again, the fact that I obviously speak very, very quickly from time to time. So let's start off with Tony over at Deadline, where he has Mean Girls has the edge during the first weekend of 2024. Now, this is a very interesting concept because the film actually is a part of a box office that is 8% down from the same time last weekend. Now, one of the things, of course, that he is trying to do is try to point fingers and try to blame the fact that there were dual strikes, and that had an impact on the theatrical schedule. All the while, he's ignoring the fact that even amidst all those strikes, and even before all of those strikes, there was a lot of problems going on at the box office, right? Just because your total box office in the domestic market or worldwide happens to be a certain number does not mean that studios were actually having success. We've talked about this ad nauseum, the fact that almost no movies last year, because of the insane budgets, especially of many of them, really made any money or made any profits based off of what they've actually gone into and based off of the typical marketing standards and typical takes that studios actually ultimately end up getting. And so to try to say that the actor strike is the reason why the box office is not doing well because there's no massive new releases that would have been on this weekend otherwise is also ignoring another key factor, which is the fact that January has always been known as the place where movies go to die, right? There's very few exceptions to this. We think we saw the film Megan last year, for instance, be able to, kind of shine above the typical January fare. But most of these film studios, right, because they are trying to get all of their films out before the year's end for awards contention, also to get it out for that holiday season because it's usually a time where more people are off from work and school and have more access to the box office and to be able to spend their money. Obviously, at that point, then, you're going to have a lot of studios that are not going to have a lot of plans then for that first month of the year, which is why, again, January typically is not. It's not that you can't release a movie in January and have it not make money. It's rather that the studios themselves kind of paint themselves into a box, right? I think Megan is a great example of that a movie, if it is good, or at the very least, it gets a lot of social media presence, it gets a lot of word-of-mouth campaign. We know the power of word-of-mouth, obviously. That's when it's going to be able to actually perform. And just because it's in January does not automatically then mean that it's going to die. It's just rather the studios tend to put out some of their worst movies or some of their films that they have clearly no confidence in, no faith in whatsoever. And I think that's what we're kind of seeing right now with the brand new release this weekend of I.S.S. because there's just, again, no one going to see it, no one talking about it. But again, Tony, loving how you continue to try to push these narratives. And again, I call you out in one of my recent articles. So anyway, let's go ahead and dive into the numbers over at thenumbers.com. So first off, Mean Girls indeed came in at the #1 spot once again, now 2 weeks from its initial release. $50 million total. is where it is currently at domestically. And we have to keep in mind a couple things about this movie. First, there's this whole, story going out there about how this Mean Girls film is actually doing better than the original Mean Girls film. And there's 2 points about that have to, of course, be taken into account. The first, and it's not going to be what you think it is. The first is that, well, yeah, of course, now this is actually a known entity. So it actually would, on paper, make sense for this film to have a better opening weekend, to even have a better first 2 weeks, because the first film, right, was one of those movies that was able to build an audience over time. And especially since its initial release, once it got released onto home video, became a kind of a cult classic. And it's one of these weird things where it's, obviously it had mainstream attention at the time, but I think that we could definitely say that it has a lot of cult-like classic personalities and ways of existing. It seems to its very presence. And so I think that is a fair analysis and a fair comparison to be made there. But again, that would make sense. The issue, though, the second issue, which to me is one of the bigger ones, and you all know I was going to bring this up because it's the word I like to use, is inflation. Right? So, when you're comparing a movie in 2024 to a film that came out in 2003, I used to collect my movie tickets for a long time. And of course, I realized after, this is really not the kind of, paper, the way that they print it. It actually fades naturally over time. But the oldest ticket that I had from an AMC, in fact, was Mean Girls from 2003. That was the earliest from when I had started to actually collect my ticket stubs. And so I think about the fact that this film, right, is 20 years or so removed. That's a lot of time for things to change. That's a lot of time for these things to actually happen. And so let's go ahead, because we'd love to do these things live, of course, but I do think that is the first thing to kind of point out, right? So the story that's going around is, well, if you look at these numbers right here, based on the first weekend, right, when you actually look at, based on the second weekend, right, that at this point of release, second Sunday, right now the current Mean Girls is at $50 million, but the last one was at $42 million. But again, that is when you are comparing numbers that are not going to be fairly accurate in representing what actually was going on. So let's go ahead and adjust these numbers for inflation. 20 years worth of inflation, pretty big deal. Oh, wait a minute, turns out that changes the game quite a bit. $71 million is what in today's value, as far as the dollar is concerned, the original Mean Girls would be at, versus the $50 million of what is currently the modern day musical version, right? Musical, remake of the same movie. So I look at these numbers here and I think, okay, it had on paper a better first Monday and a better first Tuesday, but as far as the actual days following that, and as far as the actual weekends themselves, the original Mean Girls actually has quite a bit of an edge there. And when you take into account the fact that the original Mean Girls got, over $221 million, right, at the global box office, and then you think, oh, wait a minute, I'm looking at these numbers here, and there's just no way that this Mean Girls is going to be able to reach those same heights. I mean, come on. Let's at least be honest with these numbers here. And if anyone's going to scream about inflation and say it's not fair to do so, I guarantee you if I was to break this down based on ticket sales, it would show a very similar story, right? We've shown this previously where I've broken down different franchises about how, again, whether you take it from the inflationary route or whether you take it from what did movie tickets cost at the time, it still shows pretty much the same exact story, which is a lot more people went to go see the original Mean Girls film, even its initial inception versus now. And again, there's a lot of reasons as to why that would be the case. One of the big things, of course, is the fact that we are dealing with kind of inflation already, right? We're dealing with the fact that our dollar does not get us as much as it used to even just a few years ago, right? This is something that's been a big problem going on in our own country. And also, of course, since COVID, we've now been a lot more aware of how we spend our money. We've been a lot more careful with how we spend our money. And I think a lot of people, especially people who would have been fans of the original film, probably saw this and said, either one, I can wait for this to come out on streaming. I don't need to go see this right now. Or two, this is where I kind of fit into it, saying, hey, I like the original film, but this was not a movie that needed to be remade. I know that this is a musical adaptation based off of the music from the Broadway musical, so it's different in that light. But at the same time, I just thought to myself, look, at this point, when you have the same characters, right, the same actors portraying the same characters, Tina Fey's character, amongst, I think a couple of other ones that are doing that, all I can think about is just the fact that it just seems so unnecessary. And it just seems like such a attempt to have a cash grab. And what's interesting about all of this, of course, is that because of the inflationary, ways of everything, this film, the new one, actually costs only a little bit more. So kudos to them for not spending more on it. But because of how little this movie is making in comparison, there's actually an argument to be made out there that the new Mean Girls may not even make its money back. Now, again, right now, all the charting is showing if this film has a typical release, right, a 60% drop from week 1 to week 2, which is roughly where it is, around 59%, is not a death knell by any means. And so it definitely has the potential to, on average, be able to make some money back. But it's not set to be a massive moneymaker, right? Again, so you talk about a film that's going to cap out maybe around $150 million worldwide. Again, we'll go into the charting in a second. But I think that you look at that number, compare that to the over $200 million value of the original film, and you see to yourself, okay, there's going to be still quite a difference there, and the level of profit is going to be a lot lower for this movie. The Beekeeper. Speaking of profit and not really knowing what the level of profit's going to be, Beekeeper, no budget for this film, so can't say much about it other than it dropped 50%, which is actually not a terrible drop, right? So we've typically seen, especially with bigger budgeted films, that usually the week 1 and week 2 drop is very, very large. So the fact that this film actually held pretty strongly is, I think, very commendable. However, we also have to take into account what the actual total is, and after 2 weeks, it's only made around $31 million. Now, the overall theory out there, the rumor out there is that the film cost roughly $40 million, somewhere between 35 and 40. We don't actually have any confirmation. There's no real official word on that. Any of the articles that have been mentioning this are very questionable at best. And so, again, I'm going to take that with a grain of salt. But even at a $40 million budget, if that is indeed the case, even with a drop like this as well, right? Let's say it continues to have this, where it doubles the amount of money, right, over the course of its actual run, it would still end up actually losing money. And we'll, again, talk about that in a second. The film Wonka is still hanging around quite strongly. 6 weeks. 6 weeks, and it is still in the top 3. We talked about this last weekend as well, right? That this film is seeing very, very strong holds every single week. 24% hold now, $6.4 million. That, again, is another $2,000 per screen, which is better. 6 weeks out, Wonka has more people going to see it than the brand new film I.S.S, just to give you kind of an idea of just how impressive that number actually is. Again, I.S.S's number is definitely not impressive by any means, but a 6 week out movie being a brand new release film, I think especially also being out in almost 500 more screens, is going to be very impressive no matter how you slice it. That film right now, $187 million domestic, so that has a very good chance of getting to well over $200 million domestic, and this film, of course, is started to make profit for Warner Brothers, even when you do the breakdown of how much they get domestically, internationally, and also from China. Anyone But You taking the number 4 spot. This has also been one of these interesting stories, right? 24% hold here, of only dropped from 7 screens. This film came out a week after Wonka, and this has been this romantic comedy that has also been holding very strong. I thought that once you had college students going back and work starting back up at the holidays, that this film might see some drops, but hey, apparently the word of mouth on this must be good enough for the couples to continue to be going to see this movie from Sony. So again, not making massive money here, $64 million domestic, not a huge amount, especially in comparison to some of the others on this list, right? Comparing that to films like Wonka and others. But I think that for what the film is and for what the expectations, especially for the film were, especially for me, this is very impressive, and we'll see that in the charting in just a second as well. Migration rounding out the top 5 there, dropping 15%, 130 screens dropped from. So this, again, very, very strong. This film has not had the strongest of drops from week to week, but I think that at this point we can say, okay, there's clearly enough, residual holdover every single week for this film to be edging ever closer, right? It's looking like it's going to get to $100 million domestic guaranteed. It is still making some money internationally as well, and we'll have to see exactly where this movie currently stands in relationship to its budget in a second. Aquaman: Lost Kingdom, 30% hold there. Again, percentage-wise, not terrible, right? $114 million after 5 weeks, though, domestically is just still on paper not good. You compare this to almost any other, superhero movie, right, with the exception of maybe something like the Marvels, and this is just on the low end of what most superhero fare tends to make, especially when you compare this to what the original Aquaman made, that film making over $1 billion worldwide, and this film, again, it's making money in the wrong places, and I think that there's still a lot of people out there who are trying to defend it, say that, the film's not that bad, when in fact it is quite awful, but also that it's not doing that terribly at the box office, but again, because it's only really making big money overseas, and because they get so much less return on investment overseas, it's just not a good look for them whatsoever. The only good thing we can say is that they beat I.S.S, so that's not really saying all that much. This film opening this weekend to only $3 million, 2,500 screens, made $1,200 per screen. Just not a very good per theater ratio there for I.S.S, and this film is projected to have cost not a whole lot of money from Bleecker Street, but still, when you're making very little and your film costs around $18 million or so to make, and you have to account for marketing, even if it's not, the vastest marketing campaign that's ever been done, you're still going to look at yourself probably down the road of having to, not get that money back and be kind of in the hole for a film like this, which you don't want to have for a smaller film in general. And this is a film I think that, looking at the trailers for, it would have had some potential, but I think the marketing campaign for it definitely fell apart quite a bit. Number 8 spot goes to Night Swim from Universal in its 3rd week of release, dropping another 42%. Again, horror films tend to not hold very well in the long run. The Night Swim is, again, doing well enough for the amount of money that it costs. Boys in the Boat from MGM. This is also a movie, again, that I've not been tracking because it had one of those weird releases and because at the time of the release, there was not a reported budget for it, but I have now put that into my charting. I had a couple people in my comments asking why that was not being accounted for. That now has. I obviously have no actual predictions on what I think it's going to do, but we can look at what it is made so far in comparison to what, the actual amount of money it cost to make. And then the film Poor Things is up 14%, adding to over 820 screens. This is a film that to me just looks like garbage, just the trivial, Oscar bait garbage that just has a lot of very weird and creepy moral implications. But obviously, again, that's going to be up to you whether you want to give your money to that film or not. American Fiction, unfortunately, has dropped from 400 screens. It's actually one of my favorite films of the year. It's a very, very solid film. And it's sad that it's just not been made available. And it's only made $8 million. And to me, again, MGM, Amazon, I don't know what the heck they are thinking about with this release because it had so much buzz around it. A lot of people were interested in it. And the fact that it only dropped 5% and yet they dropped it from 400 screens, that's really good, right? Typically, you would think that the drop would be that much higher because it's just being taken out of so many different markets, but you're not seeing that. So that's actually a pretty strong hold for everything that's happened with it. But still, this movie, $8,000 per screen. So people clearly do have an interest in seeing it. A lot of that awards contention, unfortunately, is going to be giving it, that attention that some people are going to want to use to, actually motivate themselves to go see an actual film. But I think the film itself actually can stand on its own quite a bit. Iron Claw now starting to leave theaters, unfortunately. If you've not seen it yet, please go ahead and do so. And The Book of Clarence, and the only reason why I'm gone now past the top 10 like I normally do is because The Book of Clarence is the only other film that has had a first 2 weeks of release, and that film dropped 57%, dropped all the way down to 14th place from 10th place. And yeah, this film cost way more than it should have, and this film is a guaranteed box office flop and will be the biggest box office flop that we're going to talk about this week. Going back into talking about the numbers over at thenumbers.com with the worldwide totals, let's go ahead and get back to the original Mean Girls page. $66 million there worldwide again. Not terrible numbers there. Right now on paper, it's looking like it's going to make its money back, but I don't think this is going to be nearly as big as what they thought it could be. I think about just how big Mean Girls itself is. The fact that there are still many, teenage kids today that have still seen Mean Girls, know about Mean Girls, understand the references and all those things. A lot of that's just because of the fact that the film has stood the test of time in many different ways. And I just do not see everything that I look at when it comes to this movie and the way that's being promoted. I just do not see how it's able, if it's going to have, or I doubt that it's going to have the same, sticking power that the original film actually ended up having. I think the box office numbers are going to be very indicative of that point. Beekeeper has only made $38 million worldwide. So again, if you look at the numbers here, as far as, what it made opening weekend to where it is now, it's not looking like it's a terrible release historically. But because we don't know the budget, we really can't say for sure. But it's also still just not making a whole lot of money. Wonka, $531 million worldwide is where this film currently stands. It does, of course, need to be pointed out that the film does have a release in China. But I think that this is going ahead to show you that it's luckily not making a whole lot, right? $5.5 million. Now, the last time we got any report from China was, in December. But that's ultimately a good thing. What that means is that it's pretty much done there, and it's making now most of its money either domestically or internationally. And as I mentioned previously, when it comes to films like Aquaman the Lost Kingdom, that film's problem was that it cost so much. It cost as much as it did, and it's making the majority of its money internationally. The reason why Wonka is not going to be as impacted by that is, one, this film is making a lot more internationally, or a lot internationally, and is going to make over $200 million domestic. These are things that, again, Aquaman is not going to be able to do. Having a higher budget is a big problem for that film, and the fact of, just how much of a split it is between domestic and international is also going to have a bad effect as well. Anyone But You, the film that I don't think anyone expected to be a $100 million film this year, $64 million domestic, $36 million. Again, look at this chart. Just compared to the last 5 years or so is what this chart on the numbers covers. The fact that this film, right, the range, again, of typical releases is all the way down here, right? So this film's typical range based on its opening weekend would be around 21 to 14 million, and it's at 64 million. So clearly there's something about this movie that people are enjoying. I don't understand the appeal, but hey, money is money at this point. Migration is actually looking like it's going to get to $100 million both in the domestic and international. This film has had, again, decent legs. I think the charting on here actually shows it, right? For the opening weekend that this movie had, typically that would result in around $29 to $44 million domestic. This is at $94 million domestic. So very, very good numbers there. The fact that this film costs $72 million right now at 2.7 times its budget means on paper this film has essentially broken even, according to, again, a more traditional box office breakdown. Of course, because it has still a large portion of the funds coming from those international numbers, it still does have a ways to go, probably more accurately to say whether it's going to have, made its money back. But I think that it's definitely on the right track for sure. Film that's not on the right track is Aquaman Lost Kingdom. Again, a little over $100 million there. Chart is indicating it's doing better compared to its opening weekend. Its opening weekend was very disappointing. Typical releases that had its opening weekend would be around 65 to 98 at this point. This is at $114 million, but as I mentioned, it's just making too much internationally, and the biggest problem is that huge chunk from China. $57 million is the last time that we had a report from China. That was on the 14th, so I expect this number to go up just a little bit, probably as the rest of the country start to update, if it still has that release there. But yeah, because a large portion of its box office still came from that country, and then even more still coming from the other international markets where they only get about 40% of the box office. It's not looking good. I.S.S., $3 million there. Again, bad release. Night Swim at $36 million. Boys in the Boat at $44 million. This film, again, has been getting some awards contention, so that's probably why it's still hanging around. And then there's this atrocity right there. Let's go ahead and go to the charting, because we love doing charting here over at OMB Reviews. And as you can see, some of the numbers are just not updating. There's a lot of issues, I guess, going on with the website right now as far as the numbers.com. This is, I have it set up so that it can, bring in information, but I have manually put in some numbers. And so we now have the first 2 weekends for films like The Beekeeper and Book of Clarence and also Mean Girls. And so based off of the first 2 weeks of The Book of Clarence, starting there first, at $4.6 million historically, that means the film will likely end somewhere between $5.6 and $6.6 million. On average, they're around $6 million. Based on the fact the budget reportedly cost $40 million, and typical marketing means it means to make $100 million to break even. So that's just not going to happen. So this film's looking to be around a $55 to $56 million loss if everything stays as it currently is. Looking at The Beekeeper at $38 million, that means right now I'm projecting the film to get somewhere between $54 and $76 million by the end of its run. Again, this is just based off of what we typically see historically. Because we have no official budget yet, having an estimated budget, and again, take this with a grain of salt, if the budget is only $40 million, I thought it would be a lot more, but let's say it is only $40 million, that would mean based off of the current rates of where it's going, it would be somewhere between a $27 and $14 million loss. So right now, Beekeeper, Jason Statham film, not looking like it's going to make its money back, but we won't know that for sure until we actually get a firm budget. Now, as I'd mentioned, Mean Girls does cost a little bit more than the original Mean Girls did, and the film is doing, again, not as strongly as that original film did when you actually adjust those numbers for inflation. But at $66 million worldwide, that means I'm projecting the film to get somewhere between $94 and $132 million by the end of its run. So let's say it doubles its entire amount between now and the end of its run. That would bring it to $132 million. Now, there's a chance, of course, just like with any film, for it to overproject, right? For it to do better than the historical standard range, right? And so, therefore, we could see this film get to that 150. But keep in mind, right, with that original Mean Girls adjusted being over $200 million, that would mean that this film would have to have some crazy legs, some crazy powerful legs in order to actually get to that point. And I just don't see that happening. I just don't see the same type of love for this movie being shown in that way. So even with that being the case, though, it is still looking to make profit, just not a whole lot of it. $2.7 to $25 million is currently where I'm estimating the end profits to be. And then again, that's based off of a 2.5 times budget. So if you change that to be a 3 times budget, then there absolutely is a case for this film to potentially not make its money back. But we'll continue to track this film, especially when we have actual wider releases coming out. So I.S.S., of course, just not really performing much and not really doing much of anything, only making $3 million. So that's not going to really provide competition. And there's really not a whole lot until the very beginning of February, if I'm not mistaken there. And so it has a little bit of room to do a little bit better, but just not really bringing people out to the same degree. I did say I would bring in the numbers for The Boys in the Boat. So because this film now is at $44 million worldwide, it still needs to make $100 million worldwide to actually break even. So that means that I can calculate that its current loss, its current ratio is around $33 million in the red. So right now it's looking like that film will probably end up as a flop as well. But again, take that with a grain of salt because of the way the current box office is working as far as these numbers not fully updating, and also this is late tracking, so And as far as just, again, how well it's been doing every single week, I have not been following as much. But based off of that, after the fact that it has been out for at least 5 weeks or so, tells me probably not in the cards for it to make its money back based off of typical trends. But anyway, what are y'all's thoughts about the box office? Let me know in the comment section down below. Again, slow weekend, so please share this video out if you thought that it was interesting, or at the very least, share out the articles that I've been writing over at geeksandgamers.com. Again, not nearly as long as some of these videos, though these first 2 articles, I will say, definitely get a bit wonky going into the numbers, going into methodology, providing as many sources as they possibly can, and the box office breakdowns will hopefully be a little bit shorter. So if you're looking for something a little bit more succinct, more digestible in the future, make sure to follow me over at geeksandgamers.com and keep that updated. Whatever, again, notifications you might need to get, RSS feeds, that kind of thing. Is that even still a thing? I don't even know. But anyway, let me know your thoughts about this and anything else I mentioned in the comment section down below. If you like this video, smash that like button, light up that fire button, Aussie, smash the rumble button as well. You guys are all amazing and beautiful people. Hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. And as always, God bless. And now for a very special shout out to all of my Chosen of Valhalla members, starting off with my Patreon Chosen members, Father Luca Illick, shout out to you, Father. Rosetta Allen, check out her YouTube channel, Eagle Rider. And Miss Mountain Muses, check out her YouTube channel by the same name. And to my Subscribe Star peeps, Matt317, check out his Twitch channel by the same name. Mr. Roy and ZK-Man, check out his website, xtheboundaries.co. And if you want your name shouted out at the end of every live stream and video, or if you want access to a giveaways channel on my Discord and plenty of other extra content as well, random crazy stuff out there, check out the YouTube memberships and other membership platforms in the top link in the video description below. You guys are all amazing and beautiful people. Have a wonderful rest of your day. And as always, God bless.